Yeah, so I'm going to be talking about mostly about the NASA Goddard Institute for Space Studies, NASA Global Climate Model, and simulating ice sheet mass balance in that model. And in this presentation, I'm going to be focusing mostly on the Greenland ice sheet and the role of surface albedo, surface mass balance. But first, I want to give you the broader picture here. Just some background on the changes in ice sheet mass balance and also glacier mass balance. So the whole cryosphere is changing in response to a changing climate. We see, these are observations of mass loss from the Greenland ice sheet, the Antarctic ice sheet, and mountain glaciers. And you can see that the mass changes are divided into components. So we have surface changes, and then we have ice dynamics changes. So there's melting happening at the surface of glaciers and ice sheets. And there's also ice flow into the ocean, and that's also speeding up. So that's the dynamics part. So we see that both the Greenland ice sheet and the Antarctic ice sheet are losing mass, but you can see that the surface is actually more important for the Greenland ice sheet, and the Antarctic ice sheet, the dynamic portion of mass loss is the largest contributor to mass loss and therefore sea level rise. For mountain glaciers, there's most of the mass loss is happening at the surface, but mountain glaciers are a pretty large contribution because they're particularly vulnerable at the moment. So to understand these processes and to better predict how the ice sheet and mountain glaciers are going to change in the future, we need to consider the we can think about the changes in mass in terms of the mass balance of ice sheets and glaciers. So there's the surface component, the surface mass balance, and that's basically the balance between snowfall, runoff, and sublimation. And then there's also so if we look at the Antarctic ice sheet, these are the components for the Antarctic ice sheet. So you can see that for Antarctica, there's not that much melting at all. So there's quite, even though it's a very dry place, most of the surface mass balance is snowfall. And a very small portion of mass is lost through melt and sublimation. But most of the mass loss happens through the dynamic process, the flow of glaciers into the ocean. For the Greenland ice sheet, it's very different. So we have snowfall, but we have quite a bit of melt. Some of that melt water refreezes, and then some of the melt water runs off into the ocean eventually. And so that's about equally as important as the surface processes for Greenland. And you can see that along the margins of the Greenland ice sheet, we have negative mass balance. We don't really see that for the Antarctic ice sheet. So there's very little melting there. Most of the negative mass balance areas are areas where there's wind scour and sublimation happening. So the processes are different processes. Are some of the same processes, but also different processes are more important in Greenland versus Antarctica. And for mountain glaciers, I don't really have a breakdown like this because there are many different glaciers, and it's hard to find estimates like this for all the glaciers, especially in terms of the components, because many of the estimates that are made of the glacier mass balance just use a simple temperature parameterization. But for those mountain glaciers, I believe most of the changes that we're seeing are surface changes because many of them are not connected to oceans. It's mostly the surface mass balance. So how do we predict the future of these changes in ice sheets and glaciers? So the way it's done now, basically we have climate projections from global climate models, and this is basically the response of the atmosphere and various feedbacks in the Earth system. But these global climate models have a pretty coarse resolution and relatively simpler physics because they have some computational limitations because they have to simulate the entire Earth. So in order to project what's happening over ice sheets and even some mountain glaciers, we need to use higher resolution models, such as regional climate models. So these will be forced by the global climate model or reanalysis data at the lateral boundary, and they will simulate a much higher resolution atmosphere and surface with more detailed physics. And then to predict what's going to happen with the dynamic component mass balance, we need ice flow models. So these actually simulate the flow of ice in response to the forcing from the surface mass balance. So that's sort of the way things go right now. There's sort of this one-way projection of the change solution specific models. You can kind of see that the problem here is that we can't really capture all the feedback between the different processes happening at the local scale and then going to the larger Earth system scale. So the ideal here is really to interact with each other. So one way is that within the global climate model, we can improve the simulation of surface mass balance and also couple the global climate model with other types of models like hydrological models or ice flow models. And if we have these two-way feedbacks, we can start to understand how these feedbacks might affect the mass changes in the future. So in addition to the importance of kind of this two-way coupling, there are also processes that we don't really understand so well. So this is subject of ongoing research. So either we don't understand the processes or they aren't really included in the models, and it's something that needs to be included. So some of these include the feedbacks between ice dynamics and surface mass balance. So as the climate changes, the ice flow will change, the surface elevation of the ice sheets will change, and that can change the climate at the surface, and therefore the surface itself. And also, an area of ongoing research is interaction between ice dynamics and the ocean. That's not so well understood. That's something that Craig is working. And there's also surface hydrology happening at the surface of ice sheets and glaciers and ice shelves, and that can impact the flow. The water gets to the base of the ice. That can cause the ice to speed up or slow down. And over ice shelves, there's concern that the ponding of liquid water could affect the breakup of ice shelves and cause glaciers to flow faster in that case. There's also the issue of storage and retention of liquid water and refreezing of that liquid water. So recently it's been discovered that there are fern aquifers in the Greenland ice sheet. So some of that water that melts is actually stored year-round within the snow and fern on the ice sheet. And that's something that people are still studying, and we need to learn more about. And then there's surface albedo, so there's feedback between climate changes and snow albedo. So, albedo is particularly important because ice is very bright and reflects a lot of solar energy, and making it a little bit darker can cause a lot more absorption and a feedback effect. So these feedbacks between climate and snow albedo and energy absorption are important. There's also deposition of impurities, such as aerosols, and for the Greenland ice sheet, there are impurities that come from within the ice sheet.
Yeah, I'm watching the summer.
And biology is also a new area of research for ice sheets. There's been discovery that microorganisms and algae on the surface of the Greenland ice sheet can cause it to absorb more energy in that the glacial areas of the ice sheet. So what we need, really, we need a few things. We need to improve our understanding of the physics of these processes. We need to get that improved understanding into models, and then we need to do this coupling between different types of models. So that's just illustrating the importance of coupling all of these. And ideally, we'd like to do that in one model so that we can capture all of these feedback. And obviously, since the global climate model simulates the whole Earth, that's the best kind of model for including all of these things together. So just now turning to one of these specific processes. So for the Greenland ice sheet, you can see that although most of the ice sheet has a pretty high surface albedo, this is from satellite data, along the margins of the ice sheet, albedo can be quite low, especially during the summer months when the ice at the surface is exposed. And that ice has a lot of impurities, including algae, bacteria, dust, black carbon, and that can make the surface even darker. And the albedo is important there because it also happens to be the area where temperatures are warmest and elevation is lowest. And so you have warmer temperatures combined with lower albedo and a higher likelihood of albedo feedback. So an interesting area of research is biology on ice sheets. This is a paper with Suji Wang that was just published recently. So this is actually mapping algae on the Greenland ice sheet from space. So we can actually observe the distribution of algae and try to relate it to surface albedo. And obviously this is something that's not in the climate models, all these biological processes. So this is there's ongoing research. For the Antarctic ice sheet, as you saw, there aren't many areas where there's a lot of melting, but there are some places where there is considerable melt, especially up on the ice shelves. And so these are some recent studies by Robin Bell and Donnie Kingswake showing water on the surface of these ice shelves and even on glaciers in Antarctica. And actually this Amory ice shelf is, if you were here last week, you saw Julian Briggle talking about that. With all this ponding of liquid water that's being, could also lead to a reduction in surface albedo. And as the climate starts warming, we probably see more of that liquid water. And so this is something that we should be also thinking about. Over mountain glaciers, surface albedo is also important. And particularly in these areas, aerosols and black carbon deposited on the surface can have a pretty big impact on the surface mass balance. So this is an important process that we have to capture in the climate models wherever we simulate snow and ice. So just to kind of summarize the different processes that control surface albedo. So we have exposure of ice, which is much darker than snow. Balance at the surface is negative, so we have more melt and evaporation than we do precipitation. And that can create a big contrast in albedo. As the temperatures warm, you start to get some liquid water in the snowpack, which causes snow grains to grow larger, and that can reduce their albedo, especially in infrared wavelengths. So there's another feedback process associated just with snow albedo. And then we have the purity, as I discussed, and liquid water that can also cause the surface to darken. And there are some other processes like crevasses, which could be important in certain areas. So now I'm going to switch over to talking about the NASA GISS model.
What? What?
So at the Dorothy's mic is still on. So the NASA GISS global climate model. None of you are familiar with that.
Sorry to interrupt. Mute their microphones. Just to stress that.
That's great. Everyone? So for the NASA GISS climate model, most of the outputs that I'm going to be talking about are with the NASA GISS Model E2 GCM. So this has a 2 by 2.5 degree longitude latitude grid, 40 atmospheric layers, model top at 0.1 millibars, and a 1 degree ocean model. So it's also very good at simulating aerosols, atmospheric chemistry, and so it's basically capturing interactions between surface, atmosphere, ocean, and ice. There's been some work done recently by Elizabeth Fisher to couple ice sheet models, ice dynamics models into the GCM. And so here I'm mostly going to be talking about climatological simulations where we have a seasonally varying ocean temperatures and sea ice conditions. And so this creates sort of climatological conditions for a certain period where we can look at ice sheet processes. So the more recent version of the GCM have a higher resolution, spatial resolution that more atmospheric layers. We also have the capability of nudging the wind to follow reanalysis data, more closely match observations using some of those features. So one advance that's been recently added to the GCM is the system of elevation classes. So with the elevation classes, we can divide every grid cell in the GCM over different elevations. And basically we simulate the surface model of the GCM for each of these elevations. And then we can take the outputs over each of these elevations and integrate that over the entire grid cell. So basically what's happening is over each of these elevation classes, the surface temperature, pressure, and humidity are being scaled with elevation and used to force the surface model. Basically increasing the spatial resolution that we can simulate. So I'm going to be talking about snow and ice albedo. So in the GCM over ice sheet and any land ice, actually, the current default is for a fixed albedo of 0.8. But there's also a scheme that's used over snow on land where snow albedo changes over time as a function of snow age. And so we can also apply that over ice sheet. Pretty simple memorization, but it captures how snow is changing over time. And then over ice sheets, we also have this an ice albedo and a snow albedo, and the integrated ice sheet albedo can change as a function of speed of them over ice. So here, I'm going to show you some comparisons between the NASA GISS ModelE GCM and a much higher resolution regional climate model called MAR, or Model Atmospheric Regional. And the MAR model has a higher resolution and more detailed physics over the ice sheet. And it's sort of one of the main models used to project, estimate current and also future surface mass balance of ice sheet. And because observations are relatively sparse over ice sheet, this is sort of our best guess for surface mass balance. And it can give us spatially and temporally continuous estimates. So here I'm just comparing the sort of spatial pattern of surface mass balance in the MAR model and also the GCM. So you can see sort of the same kind of general patterns. This area of high accumulation along the southeast coast of Greenland and along the margins of the ice sheet, negative surface mass balance. But if you kind of integrate the higher resolution of MAR onto the GCM grid, you can see some differences. So this is the difference between the two. So that means Model E tends to overestimate this mass balance along the margins of the ice sheet in general. So despite these spatial differences, overall you can see that the numbers are pretty close. So the Model E kind of captures the average surface mass balance, but also there are some spatial differences. Now if you look at the components of surface mass balance, you can see other differences. So this is showing the mass balance component from MAR and Model E. And Patrick, yes.
Patrick, so you're showing 4 panels here, one which is Model E2, and I'm just wondering, just computed with the elevation classes or without, and what difference does that make?
Yeah, so this is without the elevation classes. And actually the next slide I'm going to show the elevation classes. So,
thank you.
So this is without the elevation classes. And so on the positive components here are components that contribute positively to mass balance. And then we have melting and runoff, which contribute negatively. And then we have the surface mass balance, which is the balance between the positive terms here and the negative terms here. So you can see for this Model E default simulation, snowfall is not too different, but we see quite a big difference in terms of melting. So there's much more melting in the MAR regional climate model. But MAR also has refreezing of liquid water, which the GCM currently doesn't include. So those terms kind of balance out. Even though there's more melting in MAR, a good portion of it gets refrozen, which doesn't happen in Model E. We also see higher sublimation in the GCM. So I'll talk about why we think that's occurring a little bit. Now, going to elevation classes. So when we add elevation classes, the main thing that happens actually is that before we had a single elevation for the entire grid box. Now, if we just add 2 elevation classes, we can add 1 for ice and 1 for other areas. And when we do that, the ice is much higher in elevation in some of these coastal grid boxes than the surrounding land areas. And so when we add 2 elevation classes, the ice heat elevation increases, and even though the average, now we're actually simulating a more correct ice elevation, the grid box into ice land. And so in those areas along the coast, the elevation increases and we get much less runoff and melt because temperatures are colder, and so our surface mass balance increases. Then when we add more elevation classes, we actually don't see much of a difference. So there's a slight decrease in surface mass balance, probably due to kind of nonlinear effects of adding these elevation classes. But overall, the effect is pretty small. So here's what happens to the different components when we add the elevation classes. So we have even less melt because we raised those elevations along the coast of the ice sheet. And not too much much change in the other components. But I'm going to talk later about why some factors that could cause the effective elevation classes to change. So, that. So we also did some experiments with changing surface albedo. So in place of the fixed ice sheet albedo, we replaced it with MODIS satellite-derived albedo. And you can see that the average albedo for the ice sheet is pretty close to 0.8, but they're also quite a bit lower albedo on the margins of the ice sheet. And we also use this snow age dependent scheme in Model E. So that actually produces a similar pattern to what we have in the satellite data, but the albedo is also too low. This is possibly because this scheme is sort of developed for areas outside of ice sheets where there are more impurities. Essentially explain why there's too much aging and low albedo in simulations. But for both of these simulations, the surface mass balance is considerably reduced due to the lower surface albedo along the margins. And so you can see those effects here. The red areas where there's a decrease in surface mass balance when we change the surface albedo. And so again, the bar plot, so now you can see when we use MODIS albedo with this no aging scheme, we get considerably more melt and considerably more runoff in those simulations. And that also reduces surface mass balance quite a bit. So the final thing here is the roughness length. So you can see that, as I mentioned before, sublimation is quite high in the GCM compared to the regional climate model. And one major difference between these models is the roughness length, which controls the turbulence fluxes, so sublimation and latent and sensible heat fluxes. So when we did an experiment where we, in Model E GCM, the surface roughness length is a function of the topography within a grid cell, and that doesn't happen in the regional climate models. So when we remove that effect, we see a considerable reduction in sublimation, but it's not too clear which is the correct thing to do, so that should be a subject for future research. So now going back to elevation classes and albedo, we just did some experiments where we vary the fixed albedo over the ice sheet, and we have different numbers of elevation classes. So obviously, if you decrease the surface albedo, the surface mass balance goes down quite a bit, but the pattern sort of changes depending on the number of elevation classes that we have. So for the lowest albedo, for the entire ice sheet, but it's sort of the range of albedo values that we have right now on the ice sheet. But you can see for this lowest albedo value, there's a larger spread in terms of surface mass balance between the different elevation class simulations. So this tells us that in the future, when albedo starts to decrease, including elevation classes could be important because it could affect simulation of surface mass balance overall. The thing here is that the lower albedo value, this also means that the differences in temperature that result from the different elevation class schemes and have a pretty big impact on surface mass balance. So there's interplay of surface albedo and temperature is an important thing to consider for the future prediction. So this work, most of what I talked about earlier was published in this paper. And these are sort of the conclusions from that study. So the average albedo, the average surface mass balance, but there are some spatial differences. Compared to RCM, there's some differences in components, and those are things that we have to look into. We also identified some processes that are important, such as albedo, roughness length, and refreezing, which we're not including at the moment. And those are important to consider. We also found that elevation classes can locally affect surface mass balance. So we can get a much higher resolution of simulation of surface mass balance, and this is important for coupling with ice dynamics models. So it's important to capture. But overall, we didn't see a large effect on surface mass balance. However, there's one more thing that we should look into here, and that albedo changing over elevation classes. So right now in the simulations that I showed you previously, we use a fixed albedo over each grid cell. So the albedo actually doesn't change with the elevation classes. But if we do have that effect, we could start to see feedback over each elevation class, and that could potentially lead to larger effects of using these elevation classes when we incorporate these albedo effects. So recently I've done some work to include this process in the GCMs. So here we have our GCM grid snow depth on that grid, and you remember this snow age dependent scheme. Along with that, we have albedo that's a function of snow depth and the snow and ice albedo. So with the elevation class scheme, we're actually simulating the variations in snow depth, but we're not including the effect of that on surface albedo. So when we take the elevation class grid and we sort of reproduce that on a higher resolution grid, you can start to see the variation of in more detail. And so what we've done is we've actually calculated in the GCM the albedo that results from that snow depth, and we've scaled the absorbed shortwave radiation so that for each elevation class we can have a different absorbed shortwave radiation and really simulate those albedo effects. So now we have this somewhat more smoothly varying surface albedo. So now in addition to temperature, pressure, and humidity, we're also scaling absorbed shortwave radiation. And so this is at the ice sheet-wide scale, the change in albedo that occurs when we include these effects of albedo, especially along the margin, which could be particularly important. And so this is, now I'm showing the summer surface mass balance. So that's why the surface mass balance is negative here, a little different from the previous plot. But here you see basically without elevation classes, or just one elevation class. When we increase to 20 elevation classes, we get a reduction in melt and a reduction in the magnitude of surface mass balance. And then when we add the albedo varying with the elevation classes, we start to see more melt and a lower surface mass balance. So including this effect did have a pretty considerable effect on surface mass balance, decreased it by 41% for the summer surface mass balance. So that shows that this is also an important factor to include. So you'll see that we kind of, when we added elevation classes, we reduced melting, but then we increased it when we add this effect. So you might ask, what's the point of doing this? Because you just go back to the same place where you started. But basically now we're able to simulate more realistic simulations. So when we start to look at future predictions, we'll have a more accurate surface elevation, and we'll also be able to capture these feedbacks. So right now it could just be that these two numbers are similar. It just happens to be similar. We want to capture these processes as best we can. In summary, we need to improve the snow albedo scheme. So in addition to these improvements with the elevation classes and albedo, I'm working on implementing lookup tables from a more sophisticated simulation of snow albedo. So this is the Snicker radiative transfer model, and we're going to be using that to improve snow albedo simulation. There's also been some improvements to the snow model over ice sheet done by Elizabeth Fisher, and so one thing we can start looking into there is liquid saltwater retention and refreezing in the GCM. And then, of course, we can run nudge simulations with the Model E GCM. So this means we can more closely approximate the recent atmospheric changes. And with that, we can actually compare Model E with observations directly. So those are things I'm planning to do. And of course, ultimately, what we want to do is improve the simulation over all land ice areas and really start to capture all these feedbacks between the different processes. This is just sort of a preview of this work with the Snicker radiative transfer model. So these are just showing how, with this radiative transfer model, we can capture the effects of temperature gradient, snow density, and snowfall on effective snow grain size, which we can then use to simulate surface albedo in different wavelengths. That's something we're like that. So with that, I'd like to thank NASA and Lamont, and supported by this NASA MAP program, and also thank Harry Russell, Igor, Larissa, Jesse, and Craig for organizing this workshop. Okay, thanks everyone. Question?
Thanks, Patrick. Nice job.
Thank you. Does anybody have any questions?
Hey, Patrick, I have a question about how important aerosols are to targeting the surface of Greenland. Do you find that, I realize this is probably a frontier since you're just putting Snicker in right now, but I was curious about black carbon dust, for example.
Right, yeah. Well, there have been studies that kind of look at the snow-covered portion of the ice sheet. So I think in that area, it can definitely impact melting, but in terms of impacting surface meltdown, the effect is not so large. But definitely along the margins of the ice sheet, the models don't include any of the dust or black carbon or biology that's there right now, and that really has a pretty large effect on surface meltdown. So it's not too clear how much of those are deposited on the surface. Many many of them might kind of stick around from year to year, and there's also outcroppings within the ice sheet from previous atmospheric deposition. So, yeah, so I guess it sort of depends on where you look for the aerosols. But I think for the mountain glaciers, actually close to more populated regions, an even larger effect. So something we should also look into.
Now, the mountain glacier one is kind of complicated because I believe Bill Lipscomb says that the elevation classes actually worsen there. So this mass balance calculations for mountain glaciers.
Yeah.
Unclear if it would help or hurt us.
Yeah.
I think it might be more nuanced in places that, you're not on the edge of like either ocean albedo or ice sheet, like really high elevation. It might be the elevation classes to work right. It might depend more on getting things like precipitation scale down.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Patrick, this is Dorothy. Sorry, I want to apologize for the delay.
No
On my
problem.
microphone. I couldn't figure out how to do it. A question, I have two questions. One, have you looked at the albedo difference for something like the big thing? And because I know that's a lower albedo than Greenland, but also, has anyone looked at what differences the dust during the coral ice age would have made on the ice sheet?
Lamont, I can't remember exactly all the co-authors, but people are definitely thinking not just the dust deposition during ice age, but also deposition of volcanic aerosols and all kinds of things that might have darkened the glacial ice.
You have a quantification of it in the ice core, right? So you could extrapolate. Yeah, I don't know who would have done it at the moment, but
I'll have to look up the group. Go ahead.
Guess what? He had this person who developed winter Mark Flanner. I think he did an estimate like that. He found that in the moderate climate, black carbon is more important than dust, but the OGM dust is more important, partly because there's more dust and also because there's less black carbon.
Yeah, I think that one of the points that's really important is that once you have fresh snow anywhere, like all of the albedo effects, those are going to be masked out. So when it becomes super important is around the edges where you have ablation zones and you can concentrate those contaminants in the ice sheet.
sure.
Patrick, do you have an opinion?
Yeah, I don't know too much about historical work. Yeah, that's all very interesting. Maybe something we should look into with the improved albedo.
Any further questions?
Thanks, everyone.
Thank Patrick again, and I hope everyone has a great day.
Thank you. Bye.
Cheers, bye. Thank you, Patrick. I think that went really well. I've got a fantastic recording of this. So I'll try to get that up as soon as possible.